Hi, and welcome to the fourth lecture in the UX Design Prototyping course given by the Technical University of Denmark. Now, one thing when we talk about applying lean methods to user experience, then it sounds a little like this is only sort of a matter-of-fact thing, defining the needs for a specific segment and how do you provide unique value and blah, blah. Actually, it's a very emotional thing, right? Don Norman, writing in his book about emotional design years back, talked about that this is really what defines a product. First of all, that it has an emotional appeal that we get attached to or let's say our laptops, smartphones, or often the feel of control, which you might have, whether it's you sitting behind the steering wheel of a BMW or just having a really nice Japanese kitchen knife, the feeling of control that you sort of can slice through something without chopping off your fingers. Or maybe it's also something which is very tactile, for example, the first smartphones with the touchscreens, where this idea of you actually being able to select something by just manipulating it directly. That type of kind of feedback is really important. But I think that what we started talking about in the previous lecture, Internet of Things, how we can connect up stuff, really puts this at yet another level, because there's so many ways now to generate data. And this means when we do something like these little recipes where we go in and say this trigger, let's say closing the door of the BMW, or turning on the lights, or this event in the calendar triggering something else, we start this avalanche of data, which will actually may result in a very long time series of events where something triggers an action at some point describing an event, and maybe there's this parameter as we talked about in the previous lecture, which relates to some preferences. And this means that we by now then start to model these events as they unfold and how people are satisfied with these preferences at various points in the day when the context changes. And this really becomes very complex very quickly. And to cope with these things, I thought we should look at yet another tool, user story maps, which in this case here is from Stories on Board, which is a very nice online platform for sharing and editing your designs. And what we're talking about here is really a scoping tool. So what we talk about here in terms of user experience is what is it that really gives people that feeling of satisfaction, and how do we translate this into the iterations which will make up our agile prototyping thing. And therefore, when you have, let's say, something like this, which is an example of what I'm working on, you have a number of components which you want to try out. But this is a scoping tool. It would be very unpractical if all these components you can see here, if they were connected. If I needed to sort of make a little prototype of every little part in order to figure out whether this works. So the first rule here in user story mapping is that you don't want dependencies. So that would be, let's say, horizontally speaking, you do not want dependencies. You want to be able to divide up your product in small little parts where you can say, this one here I can validate all by itself. And this also fits in nicely with the corresponding lecture material we have in the UX for Lean Startup book, the Faster Research Chapter 3, which is really about what is it you want to validate. And this is one way to look at it, where you would say you have these things horizontally, and then vertically, all the little white things here you can see are the actual tasks which need to be implemented. And these are the tasks which in the end will become prototype iterations this means that the little white ones will be very concrete in terms of it should be able to do so and so, and thereby provide a clear direction for, okay, what is it we should put into our prototype. But the other way to look at it is that you could say the little white one are the tasks, and problem is if we start with the tasks, okay, it should do this or that, which is also like the yellow headlines you see, which are the activities, like, okay, it should be able to do this and that, because that still doesn't explain what was it in the sort of in the beginning which motivated us to create this. And that's the little blue ones on the top. These are the outcomes. This is what does a user get out of this. So for example, if I have a little example here of some of the stuff I'm working with, where I get some stuff or retrieve something, this is activities which are necessary in order for this little part of the prototype to work. But you know, the user is not interested in getting something or retrieving some sort of data. That's not an outcome, that's an activity. And that's why it's so important to have these hierarchical, very small segments of a model where you can say, why do we do this? That's a blue one. It's because of it, we want to attain this and that. And that's still a hypothesis, right? We think that the user would really like this, and that's what we are then going to prototype with users to figure out whether this counts. But then we will have to break it down into the yellow ones, which are the activities. Okay, to do this, what should we then start out by doing? And you know, if you come with an engineering background, this is where every engineer starts out. What should we, you know, do? Which is the yellow ones. But that's not user experience design, right? Because you could do a lot of activities with little reason. So that's why it's so important that it's coupled with the blue one. Why are we doing this? What is the outcome we wish to attain? And that outcome is actually what you want to validate when you create the prototype. Then you will have the little white ones, which are the tasks. So these would be the slices I mentioned. You would have a slice like this. It would be related to this task. And let's say once I click on the little white ones, they will get way more detailed, because I want the little white ones to be so specific that it's possible to more or less code, or at least create a simple prototype where we know what it is that's going to go in there. And here you can also see, let's say, the complexity. In this case here, it's like what we started talking about in the previous lecture. If you want to model the context in sort of an IFTTT way, we would have these little triggers. So I have little arrays here of data, which is something triggered something else at a certain time, and it resulted in, which is the last parameter, a setting. It resulted in this case, a program being selected for a hearing aid. But it could be anything. You could generalize this, right? But it's just to say, okay, how would we do it in practical terms? That's what the tasks are for. And you could also say these hypotheses could then be, as in this case, something where you would say, we have that data and we could apply some sort of data analytics, machine learning, and we could figure out various ways. Either that, for example, some of these parameters, it could be that it would be the time of the day, which actually explained more like what are people's preferences. It could be the events, the event types, which we would get from Google Calendar. Or it could be the place. Is that what actually determines this? And it could be different for individuals, right? It doesn't need to be like it's a one-size-fits-all model. And another way to look at this is that in the context of doing this for something very, very complex, like created augmented hearing devices for users, you have a whole business process which you actually try to model as a user story map. So in this case here, this is an example from the open product guide, which I provided you a link with. But you can see the top ones here. This is like what is the audiologist doing normally in the initial steps. Then we'll end up with figuring out what are the preferences. And in this case, the preferences will result in, let's say, one setting down here. But what we're talking about when we create a user story map like this, and just a little example I gave you, that's a question of saying, okay, what if we give people at least 4 different things to choose from? And those 4 might depend on the event, the location, the time of the day, and so on. And then what we talk about is that we actually move in and out of different types of preferences for sound. And that implicitly is, in terms of user experience, something where we could say the user really prefers this type of acoustic focus, or how much you want to zoom in and out of the sound in order to actually understand what is being said, getting the whole picture, or maybe be more focused on something specific. And to give you some examples of how other people see this, is that this is not just something which relates to state-of-the-art hearing aids like the Oticon Open. We have within the last year seen a number of these little products here come out, which are more like hearables, or what you would call in-ear devices. Here is one of them, and it's really here has a high-level user goal, which is you should be able to control the sound. So if we're in this user story map with the little blue ones, the activities which are yellow, and the white tasks, which is what are we going to slice up in order to implement this. This is definitely part of the blue one. You give the user here an ability to control sound, and that again feeds into this user experience idea of emotional design, the sense of control, and the sense of empowerment, the sense of being able to actually influence what you are dealing with. And they have a number of different aspects here. You can check them out yourselves. But what is common to what we just talked about is that there's this sort of zoom in to the environment, or do you rather want to be left alone? Do you rather want to have some calm and silence where you can do other things? And none of us have hearing which really works like this. Of course we have, let's say, cognitively speaking, our attention, so we might sit reading in the bus or something like this, and then we may not hear what's going on because we are so occupied with reading something. But essentially, if you imagined an auditory interface, which this actually is more like, then you would have this ability to sort of zoom in and out of the world, dependent on what you want to attain. And in this case here, illustrated with the different sound sources, and you could have this idea of a layered thing, because again, one of the primary use cases for putting something in your ears is that you normally stream music. So you could imagine you would stream music, but to what degree do you want to be run over by a car? Probably not. So how much of the outer world should be in there? How much of it should be left out? So these are ways to do this, or it could be changing the actual characteristics of the sound. That goes more in the direction of sound design. Do you want this thing here to be more heavy in terms of bass, in terms of resonance? Do you want different types of ambience, which you could actually do? I'm not sure whether people want this, but this is definitely something you could try out before you produce it, right? You could create prototypes where you figure out what are people's needs in terms of zooming in and out of sound, or changing the acoustic characteristics of the sound. Another device is the Dash, which is not so much an Internet of Things, but rather putting many of the things you would normally get from Internet of Things into a single device. But still, it's I think it's valid to look at in terms of the user experience, because they have thought about, well, when you have something in your ears, you could have something in your ears for listening to music, but it's also a very nice placement for a lot of little sensors, because it's relatively undisturbed, which means that you could measure, in this case, heart rate. Maybe you could measure other things. And there's also this aspect here of control. You have the sound, what do you do with it? You can kind of decide. And in this case, they have some interesting gestures. So you can kind of swipe, similar to what you could do on Google Glass, where you could also sort of move back and forth in time. Here there's ways where you could also move in tracks in the music by moving. Or you could maybe nod your head. So again, if we have accelerometers in the little device, not just heart rate, but many other biometric sensors, this thing of this being kind of undisturbed, but also able to pick up the way your body reacts to things is a very, very nice idea. So what we would really like you to do now is to say, you already started thinking about how can you connect up these Internet of Things, triggers, actions to provide kind of a whole new experience for somebody. And here it's very important to look at the first two lines, right? Which is another way of saying these programs or settings really correspond to this thing we're talking about now. How much do you want to be zooming in or out? Not just of, let's say, speech intelligibility, which is a primary focus for a hearing aid, but also, let's say, how much of the birds do you want to have in there? How much of the trains do you want to have left out? That's very, very important. And can we do this in a way where we model the user behavior? What is it the user normally does? Can we learn from the data? Can we then personalize this for the user? And of course, there's the aspect like we talked about last time. I mean, you could do this with these little arrays, as I just showed, with the triggers, the events, and the preferences. But you could also say, once you optimize for one person, what could you learn from many users? And then we're more into, let's say, collaborative filtering rather than decision trees, where we would say, how much are you like somebody else? And could that help us initialize settings at a point where we won't sort of start, cold start without knowing anything, but say, it's not unlikely you would prefer something like this, and then we could improve based on moving from these sort of informed default settings and not just something where we have no idea about whether people like this. The other thing is when we combine the phone and the watch, you could look at this as similar to this thing here of moving your fingers across the in-ear devices. There's so many ways where you could say anything where you can figure out what people want, either with swiping or nodding or very small gestures, which are very rapid, is something which helps the user experience here. And that's of course very much the whole idea. How can we combine these things so that we get something which is larger than the sum of the parts? So try and do that using the mock-up tools, but at the same time think of what we want from the mock-ups is actually something where we validate specific things. And this is where the user story map comes in, because then you want to figure out, this is actually a huge project now. There are so many aspects here, and which ones are the most critical. And that's why when you do the user story map, when you have these components, you figure out, this one here is so crucial. If this doesn't work, then we have to rethink all the other things. So that's a way of not just scoping in the way where you say, these are the things which will be turned into iterations in our prototype, but it's also a way of scoping which ones are the ones we need to figure out first. And that also means these would probably be the first iterations in what would amount to a minimum viable product, that you get the most important ones right first. So that's what we're going to look at now.